Hello, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Associate Director of Alumni Relations at SAIS, and today's date is March 27th, 2014, and I'm here today with Oakley Johnson, who graduated with his MA from SAIS in 1972, and we're so glad you could be here. And we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation, and why don't we just start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I went to the University of Denver, and I majored in international affairs, and I had never been outside of the United States. And I had been, at a younger age, very much influenced by a gentleman from England who was the UN ambassador from the United Kingdom, who was a very good friend of my parents, where I grew up in New Jersey. And he used to come out to stay with us on weekends. And at the time, it was right in the middle of the Cold War, in the 50s and the 60s, and I always found it really strange that a guy who was so nice could be friendly with a Russian. Because every time I would watch him on television, they used to televise the UN General Assembly or UN Security Council meetings on television. He was always talking with the Russian ambassador. He was friendly with him. And he, of course, basically inspired me to realize that it's possible to get along with someone that you don't necessarily agree with on a human side. And for whatever reason, that got me interested in international affairs and in ultimately going into the Foreign Service. So I was married in my sophomore year in college, and I had to decide what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And so by the time I became a senior, I realized I really wanted to go in the Foreign Service, and I went to the library of what was then the University of Denver Corbell School Library, which is the SAIS counterpart in Denver, and found a book that had just been published on graduates of international schools that got into the Foreign Service, and which schools did the best at getting their graduates into the Foreign Service. And back then, in 1969, it was, 68, 69, this particular book said that Georgetown and this school called SAIS, which I'd never heard of, at Johns Hopkins, which I thought was in Baltimore, but no, it was in Washington, did the best of getting their students into the Foreign Service. So on the basis of that book in that library, I applied to SAIS and at Georgetown. And I don't really quite remember why it was I ended up going to SAIS as opposed to Georgetown, except I think SAIS was the one who answered my application first.
Timing is everything.
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
So I came to SAIS in the fall of 1970 with a goal of getting into the Foreign Service. And interestingly, I did a research project that fall on what was then called the U.S. to China policy, which was basically where in the United Nations they recognized both PRC and Taiwan as the legitimate governments of China. It's a weird policy. But I wanted to find out a little bit more about how it came about, and I decided I would try to talk to SAIS graduates who were then in the State Department. And so I had about 7 or 8 interviews with various people, some of whom became quite famous in their own right, former career ministers and ambassadors and leading State Department officials. And at the end of every interview, I asked each one of them the same question. I said, would you mind if I ask you a personal question? And this was in the fall of 1970, height of the Vietnam War, where morale in the State Department was even then at an all-time low. And they said, sure, go ahead. And so the question to each one of them was, would you recommend that I go into the Foreign Service? And every single one of those SAIS graduates said, no, don't go in the Foreign Service. And on the basis of their passionate, negative answers, I changed directions. And I majored in Southeast Asian Studies, comparative politics. At the time we were required to take a foreign language. I took French because of the focus of research at the time in the French language on Indochina, which was my concentration within Southeast Asia, and economics. And I always tell people I was learning 2 languages at the same time. I was learning economics and French. And at the time that I got in, which was in the spring of 1970, the University of Denver, where I was about to graduate, had a strike on campus. The faculty went on strike. And so the economics course that I was required to take before I came to SAIS never took place. I passed without ever having attended 1 class in economics. And so I went right into economics here at SAIS, and I was way in over my head and barely survived. So that's why I came to SAIS, to go to the Foreign Service, and I didn't go to the Foreign Service. But that's why I came here.
And tell us a little bit about your experiences while you were a student here.
Well, I was in a little bit of a different circle than most students at the time because, as I said, I was married. I still am married to the same woman that I married when I was 19 years old. And when I came to SAIS, when we came to Washington, we were renting a house up in AU Park, and there were very few people who were married at the time, and so there weren't as many sort of occasions when we would, either through our neighborhood or through the school setting, find ourselves able to sort of socialize with our peers. We socialized with other married couples who were sort of not part of the school. Having said that, there were a few married couples, and we did socialize with them quite a lot. And my recollection of the school experience is one of really walking in the door of the NITSE building, going to a classroom, walking out the door, and going home. I hardly ever went out with people who were my classmates. I really didn't have that many friends here because of our orientation towards a married life. And but I do remember the 2 foreign languages I had to learn, and I do remember the rigor of the academic environment. I remember studying extremely hard, and I had a really hard time both with French and with economics, and squeaked by. And one of my most memorable experiences was my final exam, my oral comprehensives, which I don't know if you still do those or not. I had my political science professor there, my East Asian professor there, my economics professor there, and my French language teacher there. And they asked me 5 or 6 questions, all very, very difficult questions. And I said in answer to each one of them, I do not know. And so I walked out after 2 years of effort, convinced that I had failed. I'd wasted 2 years. I was never going to get a degree from Johns Hopkins. And I went to the registrar's office probably an hour or so later to get my failing grade for sure, and they said, "You passed." I said, "You've got to be kidding." How in the world did I pass? The person said, "Well, I don't really know why you passed, but maybe you want to talk to one of your professors." So I happened to
Did you want to non-pass?
I bumped into him on the way out, and I said, "I'm obviously thrilled, but how in the world did you end up passing me after that exam?" And they said, "Because unlike a lot of other people who take the oral comprehensives, you said you knew what you didn't know." And as you may remember, I think it was the philosopher Kings in Aristotle said a truly wise man is a man who knows what he doesn't know. And that stuck with me for a long time. And I did answer a few things around the questions that I was asked, but I really didn't know the answers clearly, but I didn't BS.
It's great. Straight shooter.
So I got out of SAIS with a degree, much to my surprise, and I was thrilled, but hardly ever felt, even to this day, that I deserved it.
Well, clearly you did, because tell us about, after graduating in '72, how did your career start and how did it progress?
Well, at the time, they had a work-study program at SAIS, and I interviewed initially as a summer intern in the international division of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which I worked at in the summer between 70 and 70, during the summer of '71. And the work-study program then allowed you to stay with that employer as a part-time employee while you're going to school, my second year, which I did. And after my completion of my second year, that organization offered me a job, which was wonderful, because I had come to appreciate that while I wasn't in the Foreign Service, I was able to work in the foreign field, the foreign economic, commercial field, while still living in Washington but traveling a lot. And so when I went into the international division of the U.S. Chamber, I started off as an associate, where I did a lot of research and worked on international investment issues, and eventually became an assistant to the director of the U.S.-Japan Business Council. And long story short, I became the head of that organization, and then I became the director of Asia Pacific Affairs generally. So I was able to use my Asian background, to the extent that it was Asian, where I never set foot in Asia, through the SAIS connection in my first job.
It's terrific, yeah.
And so I spent probably 3 or 4 months a year traveling in Asia for 12 to 13 years while I was at the U.S. Chamber's International Relations. And then I eventually became the manager of the international department, and then left there in 1985 to become head of global corporate affairs. We call it public affairs, and government relations, communications, reporting to the CEO of the American International Group, AIG. And I had that job for 24 years, and did a lot of traveling around all over the world for that job, but mainly focusing in on financial services and insurance, global issues. We did a lot of work to expand the businesses around the world in different markets, into Asia, into Latin America, into Eastern Europe, Middle East, etc. And I ended up having a department of about 40 people all over the world, some in Washington, some in New York, some in Hong Kong, some in Brussels, who were responsible to me for managing the global government affairs function for a very, very large company. AIG at one time actually was the largest financial services company in the world. And then it quickly fell apart in 2009.
Wasn't the only one.
And along with a lot of others. And then I had to do away with my department. I left the company, and since then I have been working for 2 organizations. One headed up by Madeline Albright and Sandy Berger and Carlos Gutierrez, called the Albright Stonebridge Group, where I've been helping them build up their financial services practice and insurance practice. And the other, the Star Companies, which is the successor companies to the ownership of the AIG company, which are all private companies, now run by the former CEO of AIG, Hank Greenberg. So I work part-time for him.
Terrific.
So I'm
Do you enjoy that?
Still dabbling in the international area, but don't have to get on a plane quite so much.
Do you enjoy working with Hank?
Oh, very much so.
That's great. And
he's been a big benefactor of the school, as you probably know. He helped get the Nanjing Center up and running. He helped the Southeast Asia program get up and running. He's been a big supporter of the school.
And we are appreciative. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. Now, in thinking back after your illustrious career that continues to this day, what advice might you have for a current student today at SAIS?
Well, I guess the main thing that I've learned in my career, and I don't know if it was necessarily attributable to my experience at SAIS, but in the business world of the interface between business and government in particular, it is to never give up. Persistency and determination are hallmarks of a successful career, I think. And there were any number of times when it would have been really easy for me to have said, well, that particular regulation that was just passed by the so-and-so dictator of such and such a country, or by the finance ministry or whatever, is never going to change, and there's never going to be any possibility that our business could ever do business in that country because of that regulation. So go someplace else. Look for some other pasture. And more often than not, when either because of me or because of people I worked with, we concluded, no, we're not going to give up. We're going to try to find a way to address that regulation, either work around it, change it, help to change the business model that we use so that it can adapt to it. It proved to be a successful and a worthwhile thing to have tried to work around and work through. So persistency and determination, I'd say, are hallmarks of probably many people's careers, but it certainly was one for me. And the other is to be adaptable. When I was at AIG, we hired a lot of SAIS graduates, and we hired them primarily for a management training program that would land them in overseas posts as managers, where they would often only stay in the country for 2 or 3 years and then move on. And they'd have to go from the Philippines to Burundi, from Burundi to Botswana, from Botswana to Japan, from Japan to Moscow, during the course of their careers. And we were looking at that time, I'm still sure it's true for the characteristics of SAIS graduates today, for people who were really motivated, self-starters, very flexible, not wedded to their neighborhood or to their, even to their families sometimes, because they had to be extremely independent and able to move around and not be worried about whether the kids were going to be able to stay in the same school until next year, that sort of thing. They had to be extraordinarily flexible in their lifestyle. And I think that's another attribute which is, I think, was typical then. I suspect is still typical today of SAIS students, along with cultural adaptation and sensitivity and language skills and knowledge of markets and the way the world works. It's certainly a much more complicated place today than it was when I was back then in the Middle Ages at SAIS. It's requires a more adapting style of doing business around the world, whether you're in government or academia or the business world. And I was fortunately at the intersection of all three, because we tend to deal mainly with governments. I was dealing with my own colleagues who were in the business units themselves, who are business people, and then also very often with think tanks and academic institutions where new ideas were being developed or we were helping to foster them, and that eventually became part of public policy debate. So I'd say those things probably are still true today, but I don't know for sure.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for all you do to help SAIS in the world. And thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.